Good afternoon. For those of you whom I haven't met, my name is Kim Gallo, and I have the extreme pleasure of being the principal of Shepaug Valley School. Today is the absolute personification of what makes the Shepaug experience so special. And I'm so happy that there are so many of you that are here to experience it for yourselves. What makes Shepaug so special? You're seeing 5 reasons right up here. You are seeing sprinkled through the audience their friends who are here to support them, another very good reason. And most importantly, you're going to see a lot of big ideas today. Many of us remember school as a place where you listen very carefully to the teacher and spit back what they said. And that was what we called school. School is much more than that now, and today we'll show you. Our students do more than try to figure out what Mr. Dennis wants. They sit back and they think about these concepts, and they analyze them, and they articulate them in a way that makes me so proud, and I know it will make each of you very proud of these students as well. So please sit back and enjoy my amazing students. Thank you.
Can I pace or not? I like to pace. No, I'm just kidding, guys. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending. My name is Chris Dennis, for those of you that don't know me, and I really want to appreciate everyone for being here. We have a tremendous turnout. This is amazing. There's a lot of people to thank for that, and we really, really appreciate you being here to support our students. My wife told me this morning when I woke up, she said, no one's coming here. No one's giving up their Saturday to listen to you speak. Nobody. You're awfully in love with yourself, Chris, but no one really cares. So I promise you I'll be brief. And she's absolutely right. The cats don't even listen to me at home. So there's a ton of people to thank: the administration, our wonderful students, Ambassador Wallace for taking time out of his very busy schedule to be here with us. You know, when we talk about globalization, which is the theme of our forum this year, there's tremendous irony for me in thinking about this topic. We think of globalization as being fast, interconnected, everyone's tied together, yet often when we listen to the general discourse, we view the effects of globalization as isolated cases that oftentimes don't offer solutions to a globalized world. And one thing we talk about in our class quite a bit is the idea of systems, that when you talk about issues and you talk about resolutions, you want your solutions, your ideas to match the world that we live in. So that's what we hope to do today. We have 5 amazing students here. We're incredibly lucky to have Ambassador Wallace with us. We also have last year's speaker with us, Dr. Campbell. Thank you for being here. And we hope to, yes, absolutely. And we hope to be able to talk about these issues in that way. You'll often hear our students reference the experts, the economists, foreign affairs, foreign policy. In the second hour, we hope that you'll ask questions to elicit their analysis of these topics. They've worked incredibly hard on this. In fact, they kicked me out yesterday. We had our final lockdown yesterday. They said, they were practicing. They said, can you just go? And I said, sure, that's not a problem. It's not the first time I've been kicked out of the party. It's not the last time I'll be kicked out of a party as well, so I appreciate that. I want to briefly introduce you to each of our panelists. We'll start with the youngest, Jack Roush. Jack's a sophomore. He's participated in Model UN for 2 years. He's really the first. I've been advising Model UN for 6 years. He's the first freshman that we've been able to make it happen for him to come, numbers-wise and with interest-wise. We have prospective Model UN members in the audience as well. Jack's an amazing student. You're going to love what he has to say today. He changed his topic recently to reflect a topic he was looking at in AP Human Geography, which is food security. So we're excited to hear Jack. We have 3 juniors, Martin Meyer. Martin's a tremendous student. He has a greater respect for ideas than the best of us have for other people. He has an amazing respect for ideas, and that's saying a lot. I've had a tremendous joy getting to know Martin throughout the years. Matthew Marchese, we've known each other for 2 years. He loves ideas as well. I often wait to read his paper last to give me something to look forward to. He's got wonderful insights. Bianca Getzel, she's a junior as well. Matthew, by the way, participated in Model UN this year for his first time through. He did a great job. And Bianca's a 2-time member. I'm sure it'll be 3 after next year. Another tremendous respect for ideas, working with other people, participating in Model UN in unique ways. Amazing. Lastly, Amber, she's gritty, she's idealistic, she's pragmatic, she's all those things. I've had Amber for 4 years. I've grown to respect Amber in so many different ways. So with that said, I'd like to talk about Ambassador Wallace. I had the pleasure of meeting Ambassador Wallace 3 years ago. He took our Model United Nations Club to the UN mission, the US mission in New York. It was an amazing experience. Our students had the chance to meet Ambassador Torcella, an Obama appointee. So we have, you know, a Republican appointee, we have a Democratic appointee, and one thing we talk all the time about is the idea, especially in foreign policy, take your cute little political boxes and put them aside. They don't often match the complex issues that we face. It was an amazing experience. I had the opportunity to attend a conference with Ambassador Wallace this September in New York, the Counter Extreme Project. I got to meet tremendous young people around the world who are combating terrorism in their own way. So very powerful experience. We feel incredibly gracious that you're here. We're thrilled that you're here. You have a busy schedule. Your resume speaks for yourself, but doesn't talk about the graciousness that you've expressed to us. We really appreciate it. We look forward to hearing from everybody. The last hour today, the second hour, will be a question and answer, so please feel free to interact with our students and Ambassador Wallace. They're ready for you. You'll hardly ever hear them say, "I don't know." So thank you for being here. Enjoy the show.
Thank you, Chris, and want to thank the school. I've always been really impressed. We're talking about globalization, and I travel a lot, give speeches all over the world, travel for business, but I live here. So great globalization for a minute. This is all about local for at least the next 2 hours for me, and it's a privilege. So we're really happy about that. The other aside is that the town of Roxbury sent out a notice that my wife was going to be speaking here today. My wife, frankly, that's the only downside for you guys. She's much better than I am. So I was supposed to be here. I thought I had to travel for a family issue. I didn't have to. So you had one Wallace, but I think you probably got the lesser Wallace. Chris, you can relate to that. So anyway, look, we came to hear from them, but I want to talk about 3 issues, perhaps framing the idea of globalization and security and the challenges of the modern world that maybe fit into this discussion, precipitate some talk, maybe be a little contrarian to get everyone fired up a bit. But let's talk about 3 things. The first I'd like to talk about is what I think is really a secular war that's taking place in the world. The conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims in the Middle East right now is a big deal. And that might sound trite, but it affects us in a huge way. Right now you have the Sunni Arabs and the Persians literally contesting and fighting proxy wars throughout the region. I believe it's particularly dangerous to all of us. And in a globalized world, I think that you can't have a massive conflict inside one of the world's great religions across a very volatile region without it affecting us. So let's talk about that for a few minutes. Historically, the Sunni Arabs have been our allies. The Gulf Cooperation Council, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Jordan, Egypt, and others. And Iran has been a historic enemy since they took our embassy hostages in 1978, when the revolution took place. Right now, though, because of this perceived rapprochement between the United States and Iran, I think there's been an exacerbation of tensions, and you've seen greater conflict between Sunni and Shia. How is that playing out? I think first and foremost, you have to look at Iran's proxy states. Historically, their proxy states have been Lebanon, which is controlled literally by Hezbollah, which we consider a terrorist organization, and Syria. And Syria has been the one that's been in the news so much lately. Bashar al-Assad, who is the dictator that runs Syria, even in the conflict, is a proxy for the Iranians. And that, in Iraq recently, which has always was dominated by Saddam Hussein for so many years, has now effectively become a Shia proxy state as well. And there could be a lot of debate about why and what happened that caused ISIS or Daesh or ISIL, whatever version that you speak of. But what you're seeing play out in that region is really a conflict between Sunnis and Shia that don't get along, don't see eye to eye, and the Sunni Arabs view Iran, Persia, as trying to take over and rebuild much of the region. And the Persians see, or at least the Iranian regime, see the Sunni Arabs persecuting Shia minorities in a variety of countries. I don't think there's a moral equivalence. Even though there's no perfect good actor in the region, I personally have a problem with Iran. I think Iran is a very dangerous actor. But that hegemony and that expansionism is not just taking place in Iraq, which is a cauldron, Syria, which is a cauldron, Lebanon, which is having new issues, but also now in Yemen, where you've seen the al-Houthi revolution, if you will, that's really modeling itself after Hezbollah and is receiving support from Iran as well. The Saudis feel existentially threatened by problems on its border in Yemen. And the result is that there's a military conflict and horrible civil war in Yemen, but a proxy war between Sunni Arab GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, and the Persian and the Iranians who are supporting a group called the Al-Houthis. You also see destabilizing factors and problems between Sunni and Shia in other places. Bahrain, which is a Sunni-controlled Shia minority. You see disturbances in Bahrain and even in the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a Sunni majority country by far, but their eastern provinces, and most importantly in an area called Dhahran, most importantly, where a lot of the oil is in Saudi Arabia, has a very restive Shia minority that is causing conflict in the region. So you have all these conflict and hot points in the region that are creating instability in the region, a lot of suffering, a lot of death, and a lot of poverty, starvation, and the like. And because of those problems, historically the Middle East has been one of the most volatile regions in the world, and it's seeped in and affected the United States of America. Certainly it's affected it. I think that now that conflict makes it even riskier for the United States and Europe and other places. You've seen the terror attacks that have taken place, sadly, in France. You've seen them in the United States. Just recently, a terrorist attack was recharacterized as sponsored by ISIS just the other day. So you're seeing more and more of the ability for terror actors to reach into places that they haven't done. And that's largely because of globalization and the ability to communicate broadly. I was talking to the young people up here that they have a much bigger voice than I did when I was their age, right? For all the adults in the room, we don't understand it, but they count. We didn't count as much because we couldn't speak. But the flip side of that is that sometimes other people can act and count from afar and can reach into places. Think about it. ISIS can recruit and propagandize, call for lone wolf terror attacks in Roxbury or Washington. I don't think there's an internet cafe actually here, but let's use New York City where I also live. But it's not unrealistic. It happens, quite frequently. So I think that conflict, which is fomenting incredible tensions, stoking terrorism, stoking conflict, is a very risky proposition to the United States, and I don't see it resolving anytime soon. And there are all sorts of reasons why the United States could and should play a different role. We can do that in the question and answer. The second thing that I'd like to talk about is the vacuum of leadership, and I previewed the test question. We live in dangerous times. I think we would all acknowledge that. The Middle East, as we just described, is in turmoil. But historically, there have been strong leaders in the world, not just the United States, but strong leaders. Sometimes we don't even like the strong leaders. Sometimes we really despise the strong leaders. But I would assert that there's a vacuum of leadership in the world right now. Who are the strong leaders in the world today? That's a question. Maybe Vladimir Putin. I can't imagine he's a hugely popular guy in this room, not real popular with me either. But who are the other strong leaders in the world right now? And I think that is also seeing some real speed bumps when it comes to the Western democracies. Look, I am an unapologetic believer in Western-style democracy. I think it's a great mechanism of government by the people, for the people, et cetera. But we're seeing some problems in Western democracies. If you look at the Constitution, it says a more perfect union, not the perfect union. So we're not perfect, but we're pretty darn good, and I do believe that our system is better than anyone else's. But you see other Western democracies facing similar problems, and you're seeing real frustration. Even in our election today, and I won't get political in sort of the characterization of it because I'm sure people have different views about that, and I'm not even sure what my views are. But you see real frustration and anger on both sides of the aisle. And that's a microcosm of what you're seeing in other places. Let's talk about our election just briefly without getting into the politics. I would assert, and I don't mean to insult anybody in the room by this, but if you look at the anger and frustration that appears, and you look at the level of supports for Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, they're quite similar. And even as Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump supporters are fighting each other, it's because they feel aggrieved and not heard and not listened to. Whatever their socioeconomic makeup is, their racial makeup is, it's people in the greatest Western democracy not feeling that their needs are being met. You're seeing that play out in other countries as well. You see, very weak, the United Kingdom potentially coming apart at the seams, the Scottish secession movement, David Cameron struggling to keep the United Kingdom in the European Union, the rise of Le Pen's party, the right-wing party in France. You're seeing it Angela Merkel, ostensibly some would say, another strong leader. I'm not so sure she is strong right now. She's hugely unpopular right now. She took a decision to allow in 1 million Syrian refugees. Certainly a noble decision in many ways, but it could be backfiring as, in terms of her popularity, because it's affected people living in Germany. You've seen some difficult stories, and it's potentially alienated her inside of Germany. So I think that as you have this big problem and the world a much closer place, the absence of globalization, if you believe that globalization is a good thing or bad thing, I would assert that for whatever reason, you see a diminution of leadership in the world today. And that's a big problem, I think, with the challenges. The last area that I want to talk about is corruption in governments. I did a panel, I think it was 2008, and I won't name the company, Google, that was on the panel with me. And it was a senior person at Google, and we were talking about the challenges. And the young guy from Google that I know well, and he's a friend, he holds up his iPhone, or whatever it was, whatever device it was in 2008 or 9, and he says, "This is going to change the world. All we need to do is give one of these to every young person in the world, and it's going to solve all the world's problems." And there was some truth to that, but I can barely work my iPhone. I have to rely on, all my young people, and my computer. But there was a little bit of truth to that. But I think that we overstated the ability of connectivity and association to solve the world's problems. Certainly, they have the ability to reach into communities and young people around the world. Chris referred to a conference that we did with the White House, with Microsoft and Facebook around the president's UNGA speech. And we brought in young people that were fighting terrorism from all around the world, from Somalia to other parts of Africa to the Middle East. It was very, very impressive. So in some senses, it's quite good. But why is it that we still have so many failed states? Why is it that there's still incredible abject poverty? How is it that the iPhone hasn't stopped these problems? And I think that the one area that I'm very disappointed about, that sort of the connectivity has not been able to stop, is corruption. When you look at the difference between successful states and failed states, it usually is because there's some sort of bastard at the top of the food chain that's taking all the money from his people. I'd say, I don't want to be sexist, but I don't think there's a female version of that. I think they're all men. So, and they're taking the riches of their countries away. Many countries are blessed with natural resources, and we have a term called the resource curse. Many countries that are rich with hydrocarbons, for whatever reason, the benefits of that wealth does not get to the people. Nigeria is a classic example of that, in my opinion. And you have other instances where you see countries that are rising up. I would say, Singapore is an example. I'd say the United Arab Emirates are an example, where you have had a history of great leaders who are very, very strong, smart, and good for their people, also have the benefit of resources. It's always good to have hydrocarbon riches. And it's also apparently good to be a city-state, because it seems like the city-states, the smaller countries, can do better. So I think that for whatever reason, of all the ills that the world has had, for whatever reason, the transparency and accountability that really is associated with everyone having an iPhone and being able to link to the network hasn't been able to confront corruption. And if I could change anything, about that, the ability to call out that corruption and not allow leaders to deny, to take their people's resources, I think is a key factor. President Obama did an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg from The Atlantic. It's 38 pages long. I mean, for me to read anything 38 pages anymore is truly a lift for me, apparently. My wife teases me about that. It's an incredible piece, and it talks about the Obama doctrine. It's controversial. I think if you like President Obama, you'll like the article. If you don't like President Obama, you won't like the article. Reinforces a lot of it. But he did say one thing that I thought was interesting, that is applicable to this discussion. He said, wouldn't it be easier if every country was more like Scandinavia? I'm paraphrasing, I probably butchered it a little bit, but it was a reference to saying, why can't everyone be like Scandinavia? And I think a lot of the themes that you're talking about here, we're not like Scandinavia. And I think that that's the challenge. And I think that you have a very complicated multicultural world with still facing corruption and huge sectarian challenges. And you see it played out in secular conflicts that are sectarian driven, like the Sunni Shia revolt that we talked about. So I urge you to look at that article. I look forward to hearing from all the young people here and having a robust back and forth with them. But I can't wait to hear what they say, because think about it. What they say can reach into and impact other people, unlike anything that we've ever had before. It's very interesting. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing what they say. Take care.
Are we on? Okay, good. So we'll move now to the student responses. They'll have some very powerful things to say, and please, as we move along, consider some things to ask students. Ambassador Wallace, in addition to their remarks, they're very much looking forward to sharing their own insights. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Wallace.
All right. Hello. As you know, I'm Martin Meyer. My stance on globalization and security is a concept called cultural homogenization. So there's emerged an economic term whose popularity has exceeded the title of a cult following. It's George Ritzer's McDonaldization. I believe this is perhaps the least laborious and most accessible means to introduce my paradigm on this vast and complex subject of globalization. Essentially, McDonaldization happens when culture becomes no more than the characteristics of a fast food restaurant. Our culture, the components of a fast food restaurant in all its ousting mechanical efficiency? No, it's actually more than that. That was what it was like centuries ago. Now, everyone in the world is that way. All of the economically thriving 21st century world culture, the globalized culture, can be described as one giant McDonald's company. How? An easy place to look is the transcendent economic ideologies. Globalized culture uses capitalism. From South Korea to China to most of Europe, we all capitalistically trade amongst each other with companies based on multiple shores. So we could say global culture operates on a philosophy that rewards the most efficient people and not much else. To quote New York Times author Dr. Friedman in a speech he gave to Rice University, globalization demands nothing but the fastest. Not only has capitalism, which is the very beating heart of McDonald's, come to define globalized culture, but so have its consequences. Digitization has made all information into light-speed orderings of ones and zeros. It is a defining quality of literally any country who has relevant stocks. And the internet really has no nation. Culturally speaking, this influx in information has had a profound effect on all of us. As researcher Nicholas Carr notes in The Shallows, our brains have faltered in linear thinking, rewiring for sporadic, efficient thought. These, among other reasons, prove the majority of the world's culture is cumulatively a fast food restaurant. And if you want to join with that economically thriving, dynamic singularity and not be isolated like North Korea or extorted by vastly more enormous and thus accessible franchises like the majority of the African continent, you'd better like it. Because the cultural convergence is inherent in the very system it inhabits. Here's the problem. Homogenization is a massive security threat to our lives, our diversity, and ironically, the globalized human race itself. So first, on the threat to our lives. Anthony Gibbons, a leading British sociologist, remarks upon the incredible allegiance to one's culture as one that can exceed the value of living. When it becomes a choice between one's own life and one's own values, the paradox's dead orchestrator is often made closure. In other words, cultural homogenization is often met with lethal retaliation. Such globalization resultants include terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They present a visceral and physical threat to security. But I won't go too much into it because Matthew is going to talk and explore in further detail the concepts of ethnic violence that do arise in many ways from cultural homogenization. But there's another, less tangible threat to security: the security of diversity, which inevitably is compromised when a culture assimilates and homogenizes to the global sphere. The existence of this phenomenon I substantiated with McDonaldization, but why should we care about the security of diversity? Some would say a vast reduction in differences may be predominantly toward peace. Yet, diversity is among the most momentous intellectual and creative resources. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, US-born citizens living in metropolitan areas where the share of foreign-born increased between 1970 and 1990 experienced a significant increase in their wage and the rental price of their housing. Unique cultures bring unique ideas, rewarded, ironically, in the capitalist system. Expositions of this diversity can be observed in their purest manifestation with art. The invaluable iniquity of African fingerprinted versus European oil canvas, of Tibetan folk music and American rock and roll, of Japanese animation and French film noir. First-generation immigrants, before assimilating into the globalized world, have presented some of our most innovative ideas. Look at Google, founded by Russian Sergey Brin, or Albert Einstein's obviously brilliant imagination. All unique cultures, once again, bring unique ideas. There is the argument that globalization has actually exposed more cultures. Sadly, this is an illusion crafted by the delusion of smaller cultures into the global one. Perhaps the most ambiguous argument on this security of diversity is the right for cultural perseverance, a right whose violation could be judged as criminal. Yet that's a moral line too blurred for such a profound choice to be individually instated. The last, most existential security threat is the danger of a singular globalized ideology. Should it fall, we all fall with it. We can see this concept realized on a less abstract level. ISIS is everyone's problem. The crash of 2008 and the economy hit the entire world. When one pin is pulled out, the entire monetary state falters. To quote Dr. Friedman, all threats are integrated. And a culture is just as subject to this universal Achilles heel. It is not invincible. We've seen communist values flip Russia, rejection of monarchy philosophies recreate France in the French Revolution. These changes are composers of carnage. And on a scale the size of the entire world, a revolution against the industry culture would be catastrophic. So the question we all must consider is whether humanity's intellectual unity or division is most desirable in this brave new world. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Martin for his great speech that he just made, and I will be talking about ethnic conflict and its relations to globalization and security. Ethnicity is based on the way that people identify as a part of a group due to their ancestral heritage, cultural similarities, and self-identification. People within ethnic groups are more likely to support each other and align politically with each other. Overall, people feel more comfortable around those who speak the same language, share a culture, and have similar heritage. The negative side to this is that we are less sympathetic toward others who are not like the groups we are a part of. This may seem like an archaic view now, but we all hold implicit biases, and people in other nations simply have different views of the complex histories between ethnic groups. However, negative instincts towards ethnic groups have been mostly exacerbated by global warming, by globalization, and it is hard to see any benefits that this system has had on ethnopolitics. To look at globalization in this sense is backed by two things: the spread of the nation state and increased trade between nations. To look at the idea of the nation state, we must first look at the definition of globalization. Well-known and experienced sociologist David Giddens defines globalization as the intensification of worldwide social relations which links distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away and vice versa. This, along with the spread of westernized liberal democracy, has led to huge issues for smaller ethnic identities that get left in the dust. The convergence theory is most held up by people analyzing this issue. It states about how capitalism and liberal democracy work as homogenizing agents, swapping distinct cultures and ethnic identities for larger, more universal, naturalized identities. This is an issue for many multi-ethnic states. We see certain ethnic groups become ingrained in a political ideology, polarizing the politics of a certain nation. So it is the dominion of majorities over minorities and that lead to conflict itself, and it is the polarization of politics that can perpetuate it. Most problems lie within the unitary state. The unitary system has one overarching entity governing over smaller dominions who only have the power that the larger entity delegates to them. This is a huge issue because whoever controls the sole entity controls the land of other ethnic minorities. When ethnic minorities see unfair representation in their governments, they lash out. And most unitary states are established because of globalization itself. It was the foundation of globalization during the colonial era that led to Europeans establishing arbitrary unitary states, and it is these states that now breed violence. The second aspect of this is an economical one. You might ask yourself, why does China want to hold on to such a rebellious region like Tibet? The answer is always clear: money. Tibet is mineral rich, and China will continue to fight for their dominion over a place like Tibet because of the money that this carries. This trade is an issue as the concentration of certain resources in ethnic minority areas and the increased demand for resources has pushed ethnic groups into conflict. This huge demand of resources, because of globalization, has given even more of a reason for ethnic majorities to oppress ethnic minorities and hold on to their land. This demand makes governments more repressive, makes minorities turn to violence more often because their lands are being exploited for someone else's benefit, and changes the way that ethnic conflicts are fought altogether. Also, governments like China have been seen to incite migration of ethnic majorities into ethnic minority areas to have more willing workers for this resource extraction. So the change in politics due to globalization and the increased trade between nations has had a clear effect on the severity of ethnic conflict. The clearest case study of all these factors coming together is South Sudan. The proto-globalization we saw in the late 1800s with the grab for Africa and that further connected the world. But when decolonization came to fruition, the lines that were drawn did not have any regard for the people there. In 2011, South Sudan became independent and the world's newest nation. But many different ethnic groups were in this new nation, and without their common enemy from the first few decades of fighting, problems began to arise. The Dinka, an ethnic majority in the country, quickly took power, but political infighting in the nation led to a break-off in the government. This is where we see political polarization that I talked about before, as the Nuer, an ethnic minority, sided with the rebels and the Dinka sided with the government. A political issue had now become an ethnic one, and a civil war began. It is clear to see how as a multi-ethnic state that was established by people with no regard for complex ethnicities can polarize politics and lead to ethnic violence. The government then took South Sudan and completely stripped ethnic groups of their self-governance as they redrew boundaries and put Dinka governors in control of each new district. Though there are different ethnic groups in South Sudan, the reason why the Nuer and the Dinka take the forefront of this conflict is because of globalization. The interconnected trade networks of the world that come with globalization and the demand for petroleum means that the fighting goes on in most of the petrol-rich areas, and those ethnicities get caught up in the conflicts. And the ethnicities that control those petrol-rich areas are the Nuer. It is clear to see that the establishment of the unitary nation-state and the interconnected trade networks due to globalization has only exacerbated ethnic conflict. These conflict zones are essential for understanding security as they breed terrorism, create refugees, and leads to minorities lashing out against the entire world in frustration. The interconnectedness of the world overall means that ethnic conflicts in a place as remote as Tibet, South Sudan, Guyana, etc., can all spill over into the United States. The economic interconnectedness means that everyone who participates in the buying of foreign products can have an effect on these conflicts as a whole. It is clear that globalization poses a threat for the stability and security of multi-ethnic states, and it only makes already known conflicts worse.
Thank you, Matthew. Hello, I'm Bianca Gutzel, and my topic is trade deals. Trade and its effects have come to define what it means to live in a globalized world today. Trade is the most tangible representation of globalization in 2016. Countries across the globe have come to be so extremely economically interconnected, and trade deals showcase this reality. Yet countless times people have strived to capitalize on its either positive or negative effects, depending on the narrative they are trying to portray. However, as free trade, defined as the liberalization of an open world market, comes to be synonymous with the rise of globalization, we must carefully examine how it affects the security of our world as a whole. As we do so, we must realize that security today is no longer only synonymous with how well we defend our borders, and it no longer only means how many weapons, atomic bombs, and drones we have. Thanks to globalization, security today forces us to ask the question of economic safety. Since the implementation of NAFTA and other trade agreements during the Clinton administration, the American economy seems to have become much more stable and much more secure. As a reporter from The Heritage, Denise Froning explains, since 1990, the U.S. economy has grown by more than 23% and has raised the wealth of the average American consumer by $5,500. However, despite the fact that on a macro level, trade seems to capitalize on American economic stability, many contend that it is actually threatening the security of Americans within the nation. In fact, Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders has made reversing trade policies like NAFTA, CAFTA, and the PNTR with China a cornerstone to his policy outlook, since he believes they have driven down wages and caused for the loss of millions of jobs in the U.S. Many people and experts who oppose trade agreements like those previously mentioned fear that they will outsource too many jobs to foreign developing countries and lead to things like income inequality, which Amber will talk about. However, I believe that each nation should seek to capitalize on whether trade is having positive or negative effects on its economic stability. No nation in the U.S.'s position, where unemployment is lower than it has been in many years and where the average American worker is making more than they used to, should be so quick to repeal any trade deal. In fact, accords based on trade have shown that in more ways than one, they can improve the national security of a country, besides being able to benefit from its economic stability. Trade deals have without doubt shaped the nature of national security in many nations. The trade deals, many experts say that trade deals allow for countries to be more economically interconnected. And this economic interconnectedness, in turn, improves the positive relationship between these countries and maintains their security. As a Polachek study suggests, on average, a doubling of trade between two countries leads to a 20% decrease in hostility between them. That's crucial. And yes, as countries become more dependent on each other, there is at times a risk of a trade war, like the current possibility in China, where until China stops weakening the yuan, global markets will struggle to stabilize. Yes, countries that become economically dependent on each other can very well and very quickly destabilize each other's markets. But issues like this occur only in our globalized world when nations refuse to cooperate with the trade-dependent time we live in. And not only are good trade deals meant to prevent exactly that from happening, it is also a general understanding that when countries are tied by trade, they are less likely to cause instability amongst one another and inspire violence, because that will affect their own economy as well. As a Patterson International Trade Report stated, in fact, mutual dependence makes conflict more costly. In many ways, trade deals allow nations to become more secure. In a world where it seems, in fact, that our commitment to our allies must only be shown through military support, trade agreements are an economic portrayal of that commitment. And a great example of how trade deals have led to increased security amongst partnering countries has to do with the many times dreaded NAFTA agreement. The relationship between Mexico and the U.S., thanks to NAFTA, led to America being willing to help Mexico during the Latin country's 2008 financial crisis. Examples like this really highlight how trade can enhance the stability of many of the nations actively involved in a globalized world. However, trade deals are also able to help national security in a way that might be much more tangible to many Americans. In order to keep costs low, in fact, our Department of Defense has come to heavily rely on global markets for aid. And as military technology continues to quickly advance in globalization, and international market access is now required to be fully knowledgeable on the best and the newest equipment. As an American Security Project report explains, as early as 1999, the Defense Department has acknowledged that it has transitioned away from acquiring technology exclusively from American companies and increasingly relies on the global market. Trade allows us to be able to best defend our country on a very preliminary level that is important to many Americans. It is evident that by trade and economic interconnectedness with other countries, national security is reinforced among all nations in a globalized system. As trade deals can show commitment to our allies, decrease hostility among nations, and improve the military technologies of those countries who are economically intertwined through trade. Now, trade is complex and multifaceted and unpredictable, but trade is globalization, and in today's world, it is unavoidable. It is an unavoidable reality for a country's survival. And trade deals are simply an attempt at maintaining the economic and national security between countries in a globalized world, all the while monitoring the negative effects the previously mentioned issues like income inequality and outsourcing of jobs can lead to. But trade deals have the potential to prevent those things by limiting the amount of power big corporations have and capping the amount of jobs that can be outsourced. Trade deals are able to do this. And when not properly managed, trade can threaten our security by causing trade wars that I've talked about before and can destabilize markets like what I've said with China. But again, trade accords are and should be made to settle an agreement amongst nations that will prevent this from happening. So before considering repealing any trade deals or negotiating any new ones like NAFTA, the TPP, the TPIP with the EU, It is essential for our governments to assure the accords are solely enhancing the positive aspects globalization has with security that I've explained here today. Trade in today's world is essential and unavoidable, so we must sponsor the deals that can attempt to capitalize and improve our reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca. As you all know, my name is Amber Wright, and today I intend to talk about how globalization has fostered within country income inequality. In an era in which economies and societies across the globe are integrating in an intense fashion, the question arises as to whether global income rates are rising or falling. Some have made the argument that income inequality within countries has increased vastly with globalization. I intend to tackle this point today. Global economists have proclaimed that as globalization has expanded, the distribution of income within countries has become tremendously unequal. As economies and societies worldwide have become more integrated, highly skilled workers have benefited by having a wide variety of employment opportunities. These workers span from actors whose movies are being viewed by a wider audience to businessmen whose goods are being sold over a wider region. Meanwhile, according to the Council on Foreign Relations, globalization has negatively impacted other workers, especially Americans, by their employment positions being filled overseas, increased labor competition worldwide, and an emergence of stagnant incomes. There is a trend in which more educated workers are reaping the benefits of a globalized economy, while less educated workers are suffering. For example, the Department of Commerce released a statistic that big-name multinational corporations reduced their American workforce by 2.9 million in the 2000s and increased their overseas employment by 2.4 million. Professor of Public and International Affairs at George Mason University, Steve Perlstein, explained the reason for overseas outsourcing by stating that equity firms have felt the need to cut costs by any means necessary. They aim to increase short-term profits and share prices, and as a method of doing so, they've begun to send employment overseas. As more manufacturing and labor-based positions are sent overseas, the less educated public of some countries suffer in comparison to those holding jobs based in advanced degrees. As the United States has lost a tremendous amount of manufacturing jobs, the income of manufacturing workers remaining in the United States has depressed, along with the workers in other sectors who must compete with displaced manufacturing workers. There is also a tremendous labor competition emerging throughout the world economy. In countries where labor-driven industries, such as farming, are essential to the economy, the need to be the most successful producer of goods and draw the attention of international trade partners emerges. As international trade relationships begin, some farms rise above others, and an income divide in the farming industry becomes prevalent. This is especially true in countries such as India. India is a huge manufacturer of cotton, soybeans, corn, and sugar. As one of the 5 major producers of the world's sugar, India finds itself in both the top 10% of the world's wealth and the top 10% of the world's poor. In other cases, such as China, globalization has opened its eyes to world trade. In the last few decades, China has become the largest trading partner of Brazil and Peru and surpassed the United States as Africa's largest trade partner. However, as China's trade range has expanded tremendously, its income inequality has widened as well. According to the University of Michigan sociologist Yuk Zi, the gap between China's rich and poor is now one of the world's highest, surpassing even the United States. Overall, within many countries, the amount of yearly wages earned has become vastly unequal amongst individuals from different employment sectors in accordance with globalization. As unequal incomes within countries spiral, it is likely to spark tension between manufacturers of the same goods, and tension stemming from a frustrated populace towards their government. For example, in the United States, where jobs are being outsourced, the individuals who are at a loss for employment may become discontented with the U.S. government. A longing for change could arise. This poses a threat to national security because uprisings may occur. As seen with Occupy Wall Street, having a disgruntled sector of society can lead to violence. A longing for change can also promote a higher involvement in politics and an interest in candidates who might promote radical change, like Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders. We must be careful in advocating for individuals, like Trump, who promote such immense change because it appears to be a short-term answer to the problem at hand that could also lead to more violence than it prevents. Also, as briefly mentioned before, a rise in income inequality in accordance with globalization can cause tension between fabricators of the same goods. As small-scale producers hope to begin business relations with foreign investors and corporations, and become part of the 1% who get ahead, they begin to undermine the business of their competitors. This can cause violence between competing manufacturers. In a general sense, globalization and its widening of income inequality has the potential to spark violence. While it is prevalent that within country income inequality has risen with globalization, some have argued that the worldwide income, in a general sense, has increased with globalization. As the dispersion of income across the globe has increased, countries have become more economically equal. While this point is relevant, the fact that income distribution within countries has become incredibly unequal is still a pressing issue. In an attempt to lessen this, countries can begin to cut trade deals and keep production within the country itself. This allows for more within-country job security and can limit a disgruntled attitude amongst a certain populace and by proxy limit violence. An alternative would be to limit the power within corporations so that the gap between the rich and poor is less significant. In conclusion, within-country income rates worldwide have been progressively becoming more unequal as globalization has risen. The question is, can we stop the issue before violence erupts? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jack Roush. Before I begin, I'd like to thank you all again for coming and to thank Ambassador Wallace for making it. I am going to be talking about food security and globalization today. The world as we know it is born of food security. Without it, we would, without a doubt, not be here today. Food security built civilization, whether it be along the Nile or in the Fertile Crescent where the first granaries appeared millennia ago. Food security sprung the world forth into modern times, when record grain surpluses allowed for rapid modernization and necessitated innovation, sparking the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. Food security is not just about being able to eat 3 meals a day. It can make or break even the stablest of states, with its boundless yet often unsung impacts on everything from political ideology to warfare. It is one of the most important forces behind global security today. Food security is access by all people in a population at all times to enough food to lead a healthy, productive life. According to The Economist, 1 out of 8 people in the world were malnourished in 2013, which is almost 3 times the population of the United States. This population is not evenly distributed across the world, with only 16 million people lacking food security found in the entire developed world, with the other 854 million concentrated in mainly South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Since 1990, the amount of people without food security has decreased by almost 34%. This is extremely high, but has taken place almost exclusively in East Asia, according to the World Health Organization. Development in urban China, as well as countries such as the Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand, has allowed for this seemingly unprecedented decrease to occur. However, according to the Global Hunger Index from the World Health Organization, 19 countries retain their status of alarming levels of hunger. Lack of food security acts as a catalyst for conflict worldwide. Lack of food builds unrest and desperation in the populace, traits making them more prone to drastic measures and violent acts. It is a threat multiplier. A population's drive to violence during protests is increased tenfold when they are doing so on empty stomachs. The United Nations University and World Food Program have created a theory with regards to this. It is called the chicken and egg theory. This theory states that food insecurity creates conflict, and that conflict perpetuates this by creating food insecurity. There is no better example of this in Syria. However, if you look to my map up here, I don't know if you can see it, but on the left side, it is a map displaying the food insecurity in countries around the world. Red is less food security, and the right displays civil unrest around the world. As you can see, the countries with more civil unrest also have more lack of food security, and the countries with less food security are more prone to civil unrest. To go back to Syria, food security is rarely the sole reason to fight, but all too often it becomes an exasperation of present issues. In Syria, 2003 saw the influx of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi refugees, and 2006 saw some of the biggest crop failures in history due to attempted liberalization of the industry by the government. The refugees faced hardships such as high prices of living and very few individual freedoms. This led to mass hunger amongst the population. Then came debilitating drought, which was the worst in decades, according to multiple United Nations agencies. This led to a cycle of hunger in Syria, especially the eastern two-thirds of the country, where the population is more sparse and agrarian, and the climate more arid. Experts from numerous agencies of the United Nations attribute the outbreak of the Syrian civil war to this food crisis as one of the many reasons for its occurrence and dissent against the Assad regime. Even today, we can see that the areas not under governmental control in Syria are the places that were hardest hit by this food crisis of the mid-2000s. This year, almost 5 million Syrians will be malnourished. This only increases desperation, which continues the war and threatens global security. The situation has been seen similarly in Egypt and Tunisia during the Arab Spring. Going back even further, 1992 saw some of the lowest rainfall on record in Somalia, the same year the civil war began due to the livestock of pastoral nomads perishing en masse due to dehydration. This is where the chicken and egg theory comes into play, as we see unrest in Syria, Egypt, and Somalia today. Instability in these countries has made a restabilization of food supplies nearly impossible and has only led to more conflict, which in turn maintains the threat of terror and piracy around the world. Globalization has offered solutions to these problems and has helped food security overall. Globalization has allowed for the United States alone to feed 90 million people in sub-Saharan Africa annually. Millions more are fed by the developed world, keeping relative stability in high-risk areas. However, this is a treatment and not a cure. Globalization of technology and trade gives the world vast potential to stop these problems at the start by allowing for new technologies in the field of genetic modification, aquaculture, agriscience, and more to make food stability possible in places with poor climates or outdated, inefficient farming methods. War can make this difficult, as can ideologies within both developed and developing countries, expenses, and corruption. One thing is for sure, it does not work to throw money at the problem in instances where all-out war is already present. It may be a short-term solution in other parts of the world, but it is not a sustainable one for the security within these states and the global community. Globalization gives us the means to advance the world and to create stability and understanding everywhere. But it is up to our world leaders to promote innovation in the ever-growing field of agriscience and to promote investment into developing nations to diffuse this new technology. Thank you.
Excellent job, guys. Every year I get so nervous about this. And honestly, it's like it has so little to do with me, and I still, and they're just awesome. You see it here, and it makes the job very, very fun and rewarding to be a small part of it. So at this point, we'll turn it over to the panelists. I saw you guys taking some notes. If you'd like to ask questions of yourselves, of Ambassador Wallace, and of course, Ambassador Wallace, if you have questions for the students, and of course, if you have any questions in the audience, we'd love to entertain that. We're going to do our best to pass the mic around so that for clarity. We'll see how that goes. I'll try to facilitate that so that it can get captured for our video, which is just for the students and us to watch in the future. So we appreciate that. I'll turn it over to you guys.
All right, I'll kick it off. I have a question for you guys. Globalization. Oil. Is it good for the United States to be self-sufficient on oil, or is it bad?
Bianca, you talked about trade.
No, I'll answer. I think that, well, first off, there can be two answers to the issue. The first being that since we are we are now more self-dependent on oil, the price of oil lowers because there's more oil out there. And that threatens a lot of the economies that depend on oil because now it is cheaper and so it is not worth as much. But to the same token, at the same time, being dependent on a resource that is so needed for pretty much any country right now because of how dependent on oil we have become, it can be a benefit to be self-sufficient on oil because we don't have to deal with trading, which, as I've explained, does cause improvements in security, but it can also lead to disadvantages in security. And so I think that depending on which you prioritize more, how the dependence of your country or the striving of economies who depend on trade, then that's where the answer lies. But what do you think, I guess?
Oh, look at, wait, she turned it back on me. Well, I think it's an interesting question. I think your answer sort of really framed it well. For many years, the United States, going back for a long time, dependence on oil was a key part of anything. You could argue that Hitler lost World War II because he ran out of oil and gasoline. And the United States being hydrocarbon self-sufficient is obviously a great technological advance, lowers the oil prices here. It has us not rely on foreign powers. But as you said, you know, we were frequently criticized for only going to war over oil. I don't think we did that, but I think we maintained alliances and maintained close relations with countries in order to ensure the global flow of the oil markets. And it's not clear that we care as much about that anymore. And of course, as the prices of oil goes down, it puts pressure on economies and creates greater volatility. But it's an interesting point when you talk about globalization, because in many ways, the United States is retracting because of oil. I would argue right now, maybe the world is more dangerous because we are oil self-sufficient, even as proud as I am of it, as I think it's great for our own industry. You know, we're having a little bit of an oil price battle right now with the Saudis and others. But ultimately, we're going to be we're going to be independent of a lot of foreign producers. Think about it. We were relying on Hugo Chavez. We were relying on Saudi Arabia, Canada, those dang Canadians. You know, I mean, you know, we were relying on a lot. But I think right now, the world in some ways is more volatile and dangerous because of a low oil price and the fact that those traditional governments aren't in place. I have one more question for her. Is it better to, and the panel, is it better to be a nation or a series of tribes?
You mean one nation or like all one big nation?
No, well,
Or like,
the argument that we heard up here, that globalization at times can be bad. And for example, let's use an egregious example. Let's say Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Arguably, horrible person,
Yeah.
bad guy, killed lots of people,
But power back.
persecuted. But he managed to maintain Sunni and Shia, maybe killed a lot of people in the process, human rights violations, I'm not going to diminish it. But he managed to keep the tribes in place. What about Libya? I signed a letter advocating military action to take out Muammar Gaddafi because I wanted a better opportunity for the Libyan people. But right now, Libya is in chaos, and the tribal differences in Libya are horrible, and it's becoming a safe haven for ISIS. Looking back now, is it better to have Muammar Gaddafi or internecine tribal warfare?
well,
Not just you, that's the whole panel.
This is
Yeah.
pertaining to my issue a lot.
Yes.
What I found is, I don't really think there's any, I think intertribal warfare is definitely a huge problem, but what you said about Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein is another problem that I talked about with these nation states who have little regard for the tribes and the different ethnicities that live there. And what ends up happening is usually the majority, but in some cases the minority, like we saw with Saddam Hussein, whoever becomes in power has the tendency to oppress those below them to maintain that power. So whether you're going to have tribes fighting each other, or you're going to have an oppressive regime that oppresses certain minorities, which will just lead to a coiling of a spring and a sort of explosion once people get sick of being oppressed. I think that I think the solution to this problem would be the establishment of federalist states, where certain districts are maintained and cut up by ethnicities that live there, and ethnicities get their own self-governance, along with the continuing maintenance of certain states. I think federalism requires these ethnicities to work together, but also can restrict and limit disgruntled minorities and oppression from majorities. So I think overall, federalism is the best solution that we have right now.
Every answer gets more impressive, right? I mean, it's like they're all really impressive, a great answer. I can keep going, but let's give the audience and the panelists opportunity to start pinging with questions too.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Good job, everybody. I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes.
yeah, we're good.
You know, given the pace of change in the world and the interconnectivity. Does anybody see a root problem below your problems, perhaps a foundation of what you've discussed, being the growth in population?
Martin, you have one on that?
Yeah, I guess I could talk about population. There is an irony in population and the success that has come with it. Sometimes it's easy to be really negative about it, but it's phenomenal that centuries ago we were concerned about whether we could reproduce and have babies. And your biggest concern was, will I have food tomorrow? And now the majority of the world isn't in that sort of issue. But I think the biggest thing with population, and it is an undercurrent in this, is as populations grow, we have an exacerbation of those minority groups versus those majority groups. And we have a greater scramble for resources. So yes, I would consider it most certainly an undercurrent of these issues on globalization. Solutions to population are much more intellectual than they are physical. They're not the sort of thing that the mechanism is going to fix itself. And it requires great willpower out of us who are in the position where we don't have to worry about feeding or adding more people to the world. There's more than enough. Adoption, things like that. Things that say, I will allow the world to maintain its current sphere, not to extrapolate its resources with an influx of human beings, which is at once a wonderful thing, but it's still a problem that is full of issues, as you said. So I think we are in a position where we have a responsibility to understand how population is a problem, and we have a responsibility to adopt and to fight that problem.
I also agree with Martin. With my issue, I found that population was a root somewhat as well, because a lot of ethnic minorities tended to reap the benefits of globalization less. So I found in terms of income inequality, ethnic minorities find themselves like kind of a loss in terms of globalization. As globalization has expanded, a lot of ethnic minorities haven't been able to get ahead, as I talked a little bit about how those who are more educated in some terms get ahead because it provides them to forge relationships with international trade partners. So I think definitely population is a root for all of our issues. So thank you.
To build on what Martin said about minorities versus majorities, I found with my issue that as ethnic majorities were able to reap the benefits of globalization, as Amber just talked about, more than minorities, they were able to, reproduce more, and it encroaches onto minority lands as they need to repopulate and redistribute. If you look at a country like China, which views people as pawns, they have incited Han Chinese migration into the western regions of China, like Tibet and East Turkestan regions that are ethnic minority controlled. So what happens is you have these ethnic majorities who are richer than the minorities, as Amber talked about, moving to these ethnic minority lands, and it creates huge disgruntlements as Uyghur Muslims in East Turkestan, for example, see Han Chinese immigrants in their homeland making more money than they are as they're struggling to get by, and meanwhile their land is being overtaken by another ethnic group that they feel shouldn't belong there. So.
Now, I have a question for Mr. Wallace while we're on the subject of minorities and majorities ethnically. While Matt was speaking, he was talking about how the rise of Western democracy has threatened small groups. And in your speech, you talked about how you revere Western democracy, and you did say, look, it's flawed, and there's definitely flaws in Western democracy, but you do think that it is the best we got right now. So that being said, what would you say to the fact that Western democracy can and does threaten small ethnic groups?
I don't think it does. I think that people threaten small ethnic groups. And I think that when you're looking for and struggling for a good system of governance, I think, Matt did an extraordinary job making the Federalist case, which I thought was a great argument and really well done. And we also threw in a Uyghur reference, which is always good in any forum. But the reality is Western-style democracies and the Federalist system are designed to accommodate and to promote liberal values, which is tolerance, freedom of religion, freedom of press, sort of our Bill of Rights. So I don't think that the problem is Western democracy. I think that the problems that Western democracy is facing right now is that sometimes bureaucratic institutions, sometimes the corrupting influences of money in politics, the disenfranchisement of voters in left and right, or not having people have their feel that their needs are being met, as I talked about in our speech, is really what the democracies are going through. But by far and away, if you think about it, we are the most tolerant country in the world. We are an incredible cross-section. In New York City, where I live, I think Mayor Bloomberg used to constantly berate us and say that there are something like 180 languages spoken in New York City. That's definition of tolerance. But one of the things that I would throw out to the group is globalization bad? By definition, we all live in Roxbury, Bridgewater, or Washington, Bridgewater, or Roxbury. I guess we're all probably a little bit sensitive to globalization because we live where we live, right? I know why I live here, and it's because I want to get away from New York City. I want to get away from, and I don't mean to be pejorative in any sense, but I like living here rather than in more traditional suburbia or exurbia. This is, we love it here. But the question is that necessarily bad? We've made a choice to live here, but is suburbia on our malls or our McDonald's bad? I spent a lot of time in Central America. It's horrible poverty. And the people of Central America and the poverty they live in would desperately kill to work in a McDonald's in the United States or to go live in, I don't want to pick on any community. I got to think of a community outside of the Connecticut region. But, an exurb community where there are a lot of strip malls and work in those strip malls. That's paradise because they can't afford to live, and they're all trying to come here because they're willing to accept that. We have the luxury of living in Roxbury, Bridgewater, and Washington and sort of stick our hand and say, look, we're going to live our lives in a non-globalized world as much. So, is it bad? What do you say to that poor Guatemalan or that poor Honduran who would be desperate to come here and work in a McDonald's or in a Walmart or in a Home Depot or pick your American brand? What do you say to that person? I get it. We all live here. There's a reason. Probably other reasons too, but implicitly we live here because we're not too keen on some of the more pedestrian aspects of modernity. So what do you tell that Guatemalan or that Honduran?
Well, I'm going to answer this question by saying whether we define it as good or bad, globalization isn't going anywhere. I don't think you can stop globalization. I think it's a force that has been occurring for centuries, and it's finally picked up steam, I think, probably after the Cold War ended. We really started to see that digitization. We really started to see capitalism, liberal democracy take everything. And that essence, I think globalization is a train that no one can stop, and we're bound on that course. And in the case of that Honduran, I would label it as good. Yeah. And we can approach the problems of globalization, but I think it's a good thing to label it as a good thing. Yeah. You know what I'm saying?
It's an interesting debate because we had talked about it before the panel started, and I was sort of peering over and reading his remarks, which were so powerful and articulate. I said, "Is it good or bad?" And he goes, "I don't know. I haven't decided yet." And that's a pretty honest answer, I think. So.
I think that how you view globalization, whether you view it as good or bad, kind of depends on how large or how small the scale you're looking at it is. I think on a larger level, globalization provides us with that connection. Through social media, we're able to reach people worldwide, and we're able to advocate for ideas and advocate for movements with people worldwide, through globalization. And I think that is a good thing because I think This interconnectedness gives us many opportunities that we might not necessarily had without globalization. But I think on a smaller scale, hostility within countries because the outsourcing of jobs and because of the oppression of small ethnic groups can spark violence. And so I think whether or not you view globalization as good or bad kind of depends on the scale that you're looking at it through.
Think about Connecticut is a great example. I mean, we live sort of in an enclave in Connecticut, all of us. It's a beautiful place, but in many ways, Connecticut has suffered dramatically from globalization and the outsourcing of jobs. The urban centers of Connecticut, I would argue, are almost failed states. And we know many, many people that have lost jobs. And even as we talk about that Honduran and that Guatemalan, we have to look at those. I'm sure everyone in this room knows somewhere, somehow, some way that's been affected by that. How do you look them in the eye and say, hey, that's great. The great urban center industry of Waterbury is gone. Now it's like a neutron bomb hit Waterbury. Hope nobody lives in Waterbury. But it's tough. These are really tough things, and not easy answers. Questions?
Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Youngblood. I teach here. First of all, you guys did an awesome job. Thank you. Ambassador, for coming out. My question was sparked by something that Bianca said about trade. You were talking about capitalism, and I think that that's something that we're very comfortable with the benefits of capitalism. We're really comfortable talking about that, recognizing the easy parts of capitalism. We're not so comfortable, I think, looking at the exploitative side of capitalism. Someone wins, but maybe someone loses. And I wanted to know if you guys think that capitalism is a global system that's really going to eat its own, that there's always going to be a loser. Do you think that?
I think that, first off, that's a very powerful question because it has been ingrained in in our globalized world so much. And as Martin said, capitalism is what feeds our global economy. But at the same time, I don't know if it's best to look at capitalism as a system where there's always a winner and a loser. I think that in my speech I talked about trade deals, and I ended saying, trade deals many times haven't been exactly what we've wanted them to, and just look at NAFTA. But at the same time, I think that trade deals and things, diplomatic situations like them, are a way of preventing, if there are losers, for them to lose that bad. To cap the amount of jobs that are being outsourced, to limit big corporations from becoming even bigger and causing such a divide between the poor and the rich. And right now, yes, there are people who are suffering more than other people. Right now, there are people who are, quote, losing in the globalized system, and capitalism definitely has to be accredited because of that. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't look at it as there'll always be losers, because if we look at it that way, then there will always be losers. So there's hope for Waterbury, for example. Yes. And yeah, and I think that there are, as you said, failed states or failed places in particular, and I think that we all talked about globalization today, and we all saw and pointed out how it negatively affects things. But at the same time, globalization and things that are sponsored by it, like capitalism, do help failed states from arising and getting out from, I guess, their darkness, or like Flint, Michigan, or Waterbury. I think that yes, they probably were the cause of them failing, but at the same time, the only way to get failed states out of their failure is through globalization today. So.
Yeah, a little point on the side of that. Capitalism can be seen as a zero-sum game in which you would have a winner and a loser because of its best nature, which is the desire for innovation. The only thing that survives in capitalism is the things that and this is the idealistic realm. There are corporations which extort, and Bianca's trade agreement proposal is an excellent way to combat that. But innovation is the ultimate force. What we choose as a consumer is what survives in the capitalistic world. And what we didn't choose as a consumer, the brass industry in Waterbury, for example, which has become archaic in our scheme because we have other manageable resources and other ways to achieve the same thing, are what ends up losing. But the bright side to that is rebound is possible through innovation as well. It's just as easy to be knocked over by capitalism as it is to rebound, come up with a new idea, and strike back, which is where there's hope for Waterbury, where there's hope for unique ideas and innovations, which is the competition that drives the economics of the world.
Can I bring Jack into this just for one question related to this? On food security, isn't capitalism, I mean, and the generosity of the United States and many other Western democracies, the food that we provide, when we had that map up there, it was extraordinary. It really reminded me the incredible generosity and food aid that goes into places by mostly Western democracies, some non-Western democracies, into places that have historically been the breadbasket. Africa was up there, and it showed the incredible food insecurity there. That was the breadbasket of Africa, where you were at one point when you showed it. What does that say about, you know, Western-style capitalism, that we're so generous? World Food Program is arguably the most successful UN program in the world. And why isn't it working? Is it because of corruption that you mentioned? What is it that you think, you know, why aren't the Western democracies and all their generosities helping the world more so, particularly when it comes to the staple of food?
Well, I would say that generosity isn't enough. Throwing money at all the problems isn't going to fix anything because we're not seeing them change their style of agriculture. They're still practicing, you know, slash and burn practices and subsistence agriculture, but we need actual investment by corporations into these places to change the way that they're farming, because the practices that they're using are outdated and they only get worse with things like climate change and other issues that create droughts and all that. But we need investment to increase their use of new technologies, and I think that capitalism can allow that to happen. I feel like we're not using capitalism to our advantage in this situation. We are throwing money at them, we're being generous, but it's not enough.
Is there a mechanism to deal with corruption that works in a capitalist society? Going back to your remarks at the beginning, I can see the trade deals going in that direction. Is there another mechanism that would be fair to deal with Flint? Is there a way that it works both in our modern society and like our developed society and with our trade partners who may not be our trade partners because they have such undeveloped societies?
Well, honestly, I want your answer.
All right. I'll try not to hog up. You know, former ambassadors, they talk a lot sometimes, but I don't always measure myself. Look, you know, one of the things that we've seen when you, notwithstanding that I have an R next to my name because I was a Republican, how many people were prosecuted out of the financial crisis of 2008? Really very few or none. And I don't know if in individual cases, I don't want to sound like an Occupy Wall Street person because I'm certainly not that. You know, we've thrown around big words, but how many of you remember that corporations are people? When we send in generosity to companies, to countries, we send in massive food aid to North Korea historically, and the North Korean people are on average 3 to 5 inches shorter than South Koreans and are malnourished. It's because of either corruption or terrible leaders that are denying food aid to the people of North Korea and elsewhere. So, but I think that the Western democracy, I think we're struggling with that in the United States a little bit. You know, I think that the average standard of living, as somebody said, and I think it was you, Bianca, has risen in the United States. The high net worth have increased. So the disparity between the richest and the poorest is greater, but we have shifted, and it's gotten better, generally the standard of living for everybody in the United States. But what people don't understand is the lack of accountability. And I think that we suffer that a little bit here, and people don't understand how, and that's being played out, as I said, I think in Bernie Sanders voters, and I think he's a very fine man. I think Donald Trump voters as well. You can't indict. You know, I love the debate going on. My wife does a lot of TV. I do a lot of this. There's this incredible debate, people lambasting Bernie Sanders and lambasting Donald Trump. I'm sure there are Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump voters in the room. But the part that I don't like about that is that at some point when you start lambasting Bernie Sanders or lambasting Donald Trump, you're starting to criticize the people that are voting for them. And these people have legitimate grievances. You know, a friend of mine that's local, I won't name, of course, said early on he was a Trump supporter. And my wife and I were like, but how can you support this guy? He's not, and we missed it. I guess we're the establishment in Republican politics. I don't think it exists, so I don't think we are either. And he kept saying he's going to get things done. And I would ask him, you know, I was born in Florida, and I've been adapting to the New England, you know, gritty ethic, and I kind of like it. And he's a classic New Englander, a tough, you know, thoughtful guy. And he said, you know, Mark, he's going to get things done. And and I said to him, what about this, this, and this about Trump? He goes, and I said, I know you as a New Englander don't like that. He goes, you're right. And I embarrassed him a little bit. I felt bad about that. And he said, well, you know what? You're right. I don't like that. But he's going to get things done. That's the same thing that Bernie Sanders is saying on the other side to his people. We're going to get things done for people that are aggrieved. So I think that you're seeing, you know, people more and more disconnected from their governments. And just because Western democracy and federal systems are the best doesn't mean that we still don't suffer that affliction. It's just a lot better than any other place in the world, in my opinion, still.
Jack, you spoke about companies coming into countries to help them with farming and things like that.
Yes.
You have a company like Monsanto that does the genetically modified seeds that don't carry over to the next year. How does that help a farmer in Africa?
Well, yes, the seeds, for instance, from Monsanto don't carry over to the next year, but we see numerous benefits, like boundless benefits, like increased crop yields, increased nutrition, things that people in Africa desperately need. So yes, they're forced to buy seeds every year in this example, but the benefits are just so numerous. People need nutrition to survive. They need these things, and it will increase stabilization. You also see other sources of seeds. Yes, I know Monsanto controls some very high percentage of the entire seeds in the world, and they patent them, but there are other sources as well to buy seeds, so that you have genetically modified seeds, for instance, that you can get that are, you know, able to be planted numerous times.
Are they made available to poor countries with other seeds?
I don't know at this time, but I'm sure they would be, because we're giving them so much aid that I'm sure the aid that we're giving them, we want it to be beneficial to them. We don't want to give them something so that they can't reap the benefits of that later. So if we're going to give them aid, we should give them effective aid. So yes, we probably would be, in these circumstances, making seeds available that can be farmed multiple times.
One more question for you guys. We haven't talked about armed conflict to solve problems and whether or not that's good or bad. I'm going to put you guys on the spot. So if there's ethnic fighting caused by food security, by poverty, by trade agreements, at what point does the United States, as the strongest country in the world, deploy American soldiers to prevent people from dying in ethnic or poverty-driven or other disputes? And what if there's genocide abroad? There's a doctrine called the responsibility to protect. Does the United States have a responsibility to stop genocide when we see it abroad? So from food security to poverty to trade agreements to ethnic parts to globalization, you're seeing people dying and suffering abroad. At what point does the United States say we have to step in there and stop it? That's every one of you.
Okay, I haven't.
Or at all. I don't want to preface it.
I think the line, it's less of a linear progression than it is a multifaceted thing, because often violence breeds violence in this terrorist scheme of things, especially, where they say, look at what the U.S. has done to you and your people, join us, you know? So that's another factor you must consider before you step forth with violence.
Even when you see genocide, You see people being wiped out. It's hard.
Genocide
I'm just saying.
could
I wanna-
breed
yeah.
greater genocide. I don't know, is that worth it?
I don't know, it's hard.
I like to build on that. I think a good example of this would be contemporary Iraq, where we saw that Saddam Hussein, as a Sunni, was oppressing the Shia majority in his nation. Then we went and we established a government, a democratic government, and they elected Shias, who soon began to oppress the Sunnis. And it was because of this trade-off that led to the creation of ISIS. So it led to this problem of, we have Saddam Hussein, who is oppressing ethnic minorities like the Kurds in his nation and gassing them. So we went in and we took control of that situation. For obviously that would be an example of a reason that would play into such a decision. But then what happened was it led to the establishment of ISIS, which has been even more brutal in their crackdowns on ethnic minorities. So I think I agree with Martin with the sense of, when you look at when it is time for the United States to intervene, you need to look big time at the ethnic differences in these countries, what U.S. occupation can entail, and how U.S. occupation could feed the narrative of certain terrorist groups and groups that would like to capitalize on hatred between ethnic groups.
You mentioned Sudan. What about Sudan? Should we have intervened
In Darfur? I think with that situation, it's hard to tell what that could have entailed for Sudan post-United States. United States could have intervened in Darfur, and it would depend on how we intervened. If the United States, for example, occupied Darfur region and established its own government there, that might have been an efficient way to entail that. But like we saw with South Sudan, obviously there was no U.S. intervention there, but what happened was after the Sudanese Arabs left South Sudan, after peace was dealt, what happened was the ethnic minorities in the South, the black Africans in the South, no longer had a common enemy to fight against. And they soon began to look at each other less as brothers and more as differences within their nations because of things like political polarization and distribution of resources. So overall, I think it depends on how the United States would administer regions post-occupation.
Well, first off, I agree with a lot of what Matt said, if not all of what Matt said. But that being said, I'm supposing that your comment stems from Secretary of State Kerry saying that ISIS is performing genocide.
I was pulling something out of the news that is very near and dear to me.
No.
The responsibility to protect is something
Right.
that is a very interesting
And-
portion of American power.
And I think that, first off, I think your resume speaks a lot to the answer to issues that have sponsored violence or have caused instability and security. I mean, in Iran, right now, I mean, you are handling, your organization is handling the issue economically, and whether we decide to agree with that or not, it's still not violence. And as we've said before, violence does sponsor violence, and I think in a globalized world where our economic potential is so important, I think looking at how we can handle it without resorting to violence, so either on an economic front or imposing sanctions or not imposing sanctions, is better than going in boots on the ground and causing more instability in a nation that is already unstable in and of itself. And I think after, Secretary of State Kerry said, ISIS is performing genocide, but he made it very clear that he doesn't want to, go in more, employ more troops that are already being employed. And I personally think that as of right now, I mean, that's a smart decision. Yes, we have boots on the ground right now in several countries in the Middle East with special forces and things like that. And I think that as of right now, that's what we should be doing. We shouldn't be doing anything more than that, because I personally fear that if we go in with more violence, it destabilizes the country more, and it puts us in a situation where we find ourselves in a war that we don't want to be involved in and take what 8 years to get out of.
Before we get to Amber, one of the things that Chris has been talking to you guys about is that traditional labels don't necessarily match up with Republican, Democrat, conservative, and liberal in foreign policy. And the responsibility to protect is this doctrine that says that we have a responsibility as one of the world's great nations, if not the greatest nation, I believe, to go in and stop genocide when we see it, to protect the innocents when we can. It was really a doctrine that was pioneered by a lady by the name of Samantha Power, who's the U.S. ambassador to the UN right now. As a Republican, I was a big advocate of the responsibility to protect in the administration. So you see, and now you see President Obama, who is been the leader of the Democratic Party, has looked at Samantha as a very close friend of his, and even in his Jeffrey Goldberg piece has said, we shouldn't get into entanglements, and gave an explanation very similar to what you did. And it shows that the shifting nature and shifting labels that we associate with foreign policy doctrine.
Yeah, and I think that, when we talk about things like responsibility to protect and not, not labeling people with Democrat or Republican, I think we have to realize that, as I talked about briefly in my speech, that our commitment to our allies is no longer just military. And I think that, going, as we've explained before, to those diplomatic answers before is what we should be doing in a globalized world that depends on economy, that depends on capitalism.
All right, Amber, your turn.
All right. I think part of our responsibility to protect stems from whether or not the issues in which genocide, I think our responsibility to protect somewhat stems from whether or not the issues in which sparked genocide mirror issues within the United States. I think that in the case of ISIS, where people are joining for the sake of, finding a sense of security in an unstable environment, I think that we have a responsibility to almost step back a little bit, because by throwing ourselves into war, we are, exasperating our resources, and I think that by holding back a little bit, it allows the issue to, percolate a little more, and as it becomes more, I think that part of the reason I think that we should refrain a little bit is that I don't necessarily think that we should intervene in an immediate sense. And I know with ISIS, issues have been, significantly increasing, and I think that the point in which we must interfere stems from when it begins to directly affect the United States, and I think that that's almost becoming our point, where we are, with the attacks in California beginning and being suspected of ISIS connection. And I think that in the United States right now, it's almost at that point where it's our turn to get involved.
All right, Jack.
I believe that conflict tends to perpetuate itself in these circumstances. Like, we've seen that in Somalia. They've been basically at war since 1992. So for that reason, I think that while we don't need to be involved in every single instance of civil unrest and genocide, we should be involved in instances where it just continues forever and there's no actual way to end it in sight. For that reason, I think that in certain conflicts, we definitely should be involved and with efforts to restabilize, not necessarily to end the war, but to make terms at which we could see an end in sight. So I do think that in certain instances of conflict and genocide, we should definitely be involved, but in others, not necessarily.
I have a question for Amber's answer. Do you think globalization has made it so that the issues such as ISIS or any other terrorist group are now much more immediate threats to the United States? You say that the line that crosses is when it really becomes a prevalent issue on the home front, in a sense, right? Do you think globalization has made that line much closer?
I definitely do. I think the interconnectedness of countries has definitely begun to promote a need for the United States involvement. I keep bringing up the idea of social media because it's so relevant with our generation. But one of the things was we saw when the attacks in France occurred, so many United States youth stood up and showed their support for France, and I think that part of this is because of technology. We've become so interconnected, and I think that with the interconnection, we all have a tendency to, obviously there's opposition and there's conflict, but I think that as a part of the more youthful generation, I think that we all have kind of this sense of responsibility to one another, and I think that globalization has kind of fostered this. So I think that globalization has definitely made a lot of conflict more relevant to the United States?
Think about it, Tashneen Malik, the lady that was one of the pair of the San Bernardino shooters, posted on Facebook and was inspired by a guy by the name of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a Yemeni-born American cleric that became literally the radical preacher that inspired, I think, something like 40% of the terror attacks in the United States over the last decade or so. And we viewed his speech and his ability to be interconnected as so dangerous that President Obama concluded that he should kill him. He was the first American that was killed by a drone strike, intended to be killed by a drone strike, where President Obama executed an executive order to have a drone strike kill an American who was a preacher, because his words and the interconnectedness of the world was so great that his words were reaching into communities all around the country and radicalizing people and turning them into terrorists. He said his words were so dangerous he needed to die because of interconnectedness. Interesting.
Well, and like I said, that connects to another part about intervention is what sort of entity are you dealing with here? Is it a country? Is it a terrorist organization that has control of some territory? Is it an idea? Countries are much more likely to respond to what Bianca was talking about, diplomatic and economic responses to things like genocide, more than terrorist organizations are going to respond to.
Sure. And look what happened in the case of the Islamic State. The Yazidi people were on Mount Sinjar were about to be literally genocide was occurring, and the world sort of rallied around them. But a large genocide effectively did occur on the Yazidis. And look, the genesis, in part, it's more complicated than that, of the responsibility to protect and to stop genocide was our belief that after World War II, that we would never stand by and watch 6 million Jews Jews and Gypsies and others be exterminated. And genocide committed. If we didn't intervene, there are maybe be no more Jews in the world. And it sort of formed this belief until really the last 10 or 15 years of interventionism, mostly on the left side of the political spectrum. Now you're seeing it evolve a little bit more into the right and get a little confused. Chris has really been, we've been talking about and emphasizing how the traditional doctrines of American foreign policy are just a jumble of ideas associated with, on an individual basis with American leadership now, rather than right, left, center.
Yeah, and to talk about intervention with something like what happened at Mount Sinjar, I don't think that U.S. military intervention always has to be occupation. It could just be extraction. We could have gotten those Yazidis out of that situation and left immediately rather than occupying ISIS territory. So I really think it depends on the way you tackle it.
But don't you think that one of the great, I always say in my speeches, and maybe I'm wrong, that the reason, one of the great reasons about America is that even when we do invade, whatever you think, we always leave, except when the countries want us to stay. So, maybe one of the strengths of America is that we aren't occupying forces. That if anything, the Iraqis wanted us to stay longer. We had a failure of a status of forces agreement. We've had troops in the Koreas because the Koreans wanted us there. But by and large, as a country and as a people, we're not looking to take anybody's land, I don't think. What do you think about that premise?
I don't think the United States is out to take anybody's land, but I do think that when the United States has thought about intervention in the past, I think it has hugely understated the implications of what that would mean in the future and what that would mean for terrorist groups, especially, and this is not just with occupation, but this is also with U.S. intervention with drone strikes. When we look at I don't really want to oversimplify it, but the sort of the willy-nilliness of the Obama administration to drone strike places as a way to combat terrorism. But does that really combat terrorism, or does that just strengthen terrorism?
Great job. Any questions from the audience? I want to honor this tremendous audience that we have. If you have things in your mind. Yeah, Scott.
Good job, Matthew. Good job.
Terrific job, everyone, by the way. Just one quick thought, and hearing people talk about all the different places and times that this has happened with conflict between ethnic groups, religious groups. You could look at the Soviet Union and think of it as, in its heyday, it wasn't that different than tribes being kept together in Iraq. Not necessarily. So my question is, do you think that a lot of what's happening right now is more that we're more aware of what has always happened? and that social media is making us it more into the forefront of what we're seeing, but that what is actually going on in the world is really what has always gone on between peoples, warring peoples, people with, people without, ethnic groups, religious groups.
I agree with your notion. I think that with the rise of social media generation and with the rise of interconnectedness, I think that the issues that have been prevalent for a really long time become more aware to us, and I think that this almost instills a sense of passion and a sense of fear in not only our generation but other generations. And I think that we feel that we need to act, maybe not necessarily through direct oppression and intervention with boots, but in any way, just to act in some variety, because these issues have become more aware to us, and I think that by broadening our horizons, we feel compelled, and I think social media has definitely, created this.
On the subject that you were speaking of, the doctrine, the responsibility to protect, I think that has definitely met many implications as far as social media is concerned, because now that responsibility is potent in its idealistic state. Something affects the U.S. not because it's physically on our borders, but because it's idealistically on our moral borders. And we can really see that because we're seeing the ideals surface through the internet. So that's an example of your idea, Amber, that we should only intervene when it actually touches the U.S. I think that's an example that I kind of was getting at with the question I asked you of how idealistically as well the distance between something affecting the U.S. has greatly shrunk.
Now, Mr. Wallace, I have a question regarding what someone in the audience just asked and what you were talking about in your speech regarding corruption. You brought this up, your iPhone and Google and the internet, and you said that you were almost not disappointed, but with the fact that it hadn't helped corruption as much as you thought it would. But the first thing that popped into my mind when you said that was the current struggles that Brazil is having with Lula and Dilma Rousseff, and all the corruption and mess that is ensuing in Brazil right now. And before coming here today, when I woke up, I went on my laptop and I watched a video on the internet explaining a little bit more details regarding the issue with Brazil. And so, even though I understand what you mean when you say that the internet doesn't solve the issues of corruption, I don't see us I don't see that we should have expected it to. And I think that social media and the internet and our iPhones, in many ways, referring to what Martin has talked about, has helped us become more aware of the corruption within countries. Because 50, 60 years ago, I wouldn't have cared or known about what's happening with Lula and Dilma Rousseff today in Brazil.
But is our iPhone like candy? Is it like a placebo or something that just gives us instant gratification? You say that we have moral borders rather than actual borders. The gentleman over there asked a question about, what do we do? Could the United States? I don't want to. I have many friends that served. I don't want to minimize loss in any way, but the losses that we suffered in World War II and Vietnam and otherwise, horrendous losses. Hope, knock on wood, we should never suffer losses like that again. But could the United States fight a war for even the most just cause, Hitler coming back from the dead, and suffer those losses with the 24-hour news cycle and with social media? Maybe not. You talked about moral, boundaries compelling us to act. I don't remember, you guys will remember, what was the hashtag Save Our Girls, the young girls that were kidnapped in Africa? What was I think it was Save Our Girls. I think you're right. And that, we all felt good, we all joined the hashtag. Michelle Obama, who I'm a big fan of actually, sort of had the sign, hashtag Save Our Girls. Does anybody know what happened to those girls? Nobody's talking about those girls right now, but it allowed us all to feel like we were participating. When maybe a drone strike, I'm not defending the use of drones, or a boot on the ground could have rescued those girls. So is that social media, is that iPhone really just to make us feel good?
I feel as though, social media kind of blurs our boundaries. We've been talking this whole time about what is our boundaries? What is our point of, like intercepting? What is our point of, entering and providing aid and, putting boots on the ground? I think that that line becomes incredibly blurred with social media. I think that, we do almost use it as an instant gratification. I obviously have a Facebook, and when the France attacks occurred, everyone changed their like profile picture to red, white, or blue and red. And, for that short time period, we were so involved, and our attention was so focused. And then, as time goes on, more and more is filtered. And I think that the power that the media has to kind of heighten and broaden our borders is kind of pushed under the rug. And I think that it's something that needs to be addressed a little more. I think that as this, constant need for refreshment and this constant need for the next bit of information emerges, I think that there needs to be some kind, not necessarily a regulation, but some kind of understanding that, what is our point of interception? What is our territory? Martin said that ideas have become, much more broadened, and I think that with social media, we need to become a little more filtered as to what is our territory. I think it's great that we have this a diverse interest in all these issues, but I think that we need to almost zero in on what is most.
But as the United States, if you were president of the United States and you saw those brutal terrorists that kidnapped those girls, would you go out with a picture of a hashtag, or would you have a drone strike kill him?
That is definitely an intense question.
Oh, no. I take it back.
No, I
Chris.
appreciate it. I think there needs to be almost like a medium ground. I think that there's this point where, going out and putting out a hashtag is a little bit useless because, it's not direct, but at the same time, putting boots on the ground could cause a multitude of issues. I think there needs to be somewhat of a middle ground.
Good answer.
I think that referring to an answer to your question, in no way should we, I think, expect social media to solve the issues, the complex and multifaceted issues that our world is dealing with. But at the same time, you as a believer in Western democracy, I think, having more and more people aware of more and more things definitely doesn't hinder what it is to live in a democracy, what it is to live in a globalized world. Yes, they're not an answer to the problem, but they won't worsen it.
Yeah, look, I'm not, just to be clear, hashtag Save Our Girls, there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
But is there anything, is it real,
No.
is the question, And, when you're the great power, you have to decide when you exert power.
Right.
And your power runs, we live in a different world now. The theory that I work on is that the theaters of modern warfare have changed. You used to have sea combat, naval combat, land combat, and air combat. Now you have cyber combat, where people are fighting it out on the internet to claim space, to propagandize, recruit, and otherwise. You have financial warfare, where people are trying to steal material. Look at ISIS selling antiquities or oil in order to fund terrorist activities. That's financial warfare is out there. So there are different ways of exerting power, but when you get paid the big bucks, you have to decide, do you want to assert American power to send a drone strike on top of the head of the man that killed the girls? Do you want to save the Yazidis? Do you want to stop drug cartels? You have to make very, very tough choices, and that's where the big bucks, come in, and that's where we all end up fighting about foreign policy.
I think the irony is as well is you talked about, who are our leaders? What defines who are our leaders in this world? And I think that what comes down to it is you're talking about how big bucks are defined by, leadership, by taking a stance. But in a world where we're questioning who our leaders are, it almost makes me question, how can we decipher when that point of entry is, when we can't even decide who really are our leaders? I think there's just a little bit of irony.
I think that should be an op-ed in the New York Times. You should write that up. That was great statement.
She is a media. She's
Yep.
very interested in pursuing
I'll
media.
help you get that one placed. You write that op-ed, and we'll place that one in the New York Times, all right?
Well, yeah, we'll do one more question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, panelists. Thoroughly enjoyed what you said. I just had a question about the responsibility of our leaders today
You know,
Huge. Bernie Sanders. I agree with that. Or Jack.
I think there's an intense amount of responsibility to educate and our people. You know, I think that I talked a lot about this in my speech. I talked about the need to somewhat keep jobs within our own country. And while I see Bianca's point, and I see the importance in trade, because it forms alliances and it strengthens alliances and it allows us to be protected in terms of war, I do think that there needs to be a sense of balance. You know, I'm one of these people that kind of advocates for balance, if you haven't noticed already. But I think there needs to be a sense of balance in this situation as well, because I think that we need to educate our people so that, you know, our future generations and the current generations can, you know, keep our leadership. But at the same time, I think that we also need to broaden our overseas expeditions, because there's a need to form alliances. So I think there needs to be balance.
And I think that when we look at the issues that arise from globalization, and Amber talked about, you know, income inequality in her speech, and, you know, she even, as she said, she explained that a lot of that has to do with the diversity of how well people are educated. So if we want to live in a globalized world where income inequality is a reality, I think we should understand and then look ourselves in the mirror and realize, you know, the leaders have to do that and realize that educating the people is a way to compensate for the benefits that trade deals and globalization give us. So if we want to live in a globalized world, which we're not, as Martin said, we're not getting out of this anytime soon, we have to realize that people have to be educated, and we have to tackle issues like income inequality, and that's one way to do it. So yes, it's a responsibility of our leaders to do so.
And also to talk about education. The reality of it is that education is synonymous with success. People need to be educated to be successful. That's a fact. And you find that the more educated people are, the more their chances are to become successful. So when it gets back to what Mrs. Youngblood asked about winners and losers in capitalism and the responsibility of our leaders to educate our people, I think one of the best ways to have more winners and less losers in capitalism is to educate our people. And to look at my issue of ethnic violence, the ethnic minorities who are the poorest are also the least educated. And they feel disgruntled by their government, who does not want to educate them and will educate the majority over their minority. So overall, I think globalization brings to the forefront the idea of globalization of capitalism brings the idea to the forefront of education being synonymous with success and how we need to educate our people.
My stance on education, I'd like to bring it, I was going to say what Matthew said, but I also have something to say on the concept of social media and the superficiality, which you brought up, which I think is an incredibly important point. The fact that social media has essentially taken all of our problems and accelerated them. Those missing girls would have probably never broken the news, but because of it, that problem was quickly accelerated, and because of its acceleration, it also quickly disappeared, and a new problem will surface. Because of this incredible rate of problems, we never dip our toes into them. We never feel the need to see them resolved. We like to feel like we have a say, but few people actually know the implications of the Paris attacks. Few people actually know the implications of those missing girls because they're not educated about them. Because they saw it on social media, and in that blip of the acceleration, they lived, and now a new problem has emerged, and it has disappeared from their mind. It's a superficial front that is best confronted by actually dipping your toes in. And that's what education can do. Education can teach us to think deeply about a subject and to actually approach it with solutions and implications and applications, as we've been kind of talking about today. So that's really where the value of education stands on some of these globalized problems that have become superficial and accelerated.
Going off of what Martin said, I think that the acceleration of problems and the cycle of problems with, peaking and then slipping out of everyone's memory also conceals other problems. Like, for instance, we have terror attacks constantly happening in, Lebanon, but yet the Paris attack, that's the one everyone was talking about. When, the same day, weren't hundreds of people killed in Lebanon in a similar attack? So I think education also could lead people to start thinking about what else is happening in the world. So they're not just slaves to social media. Whenever everyone else is talking about something, that's the only thing they consider. With education, people can start thinking about other issues that constantly plague the world that wouldn't otherwise be seen due to other issues being more popular and sexy.
Yeah, it goes back to the big question of how do we capitalize on the interconnectedness and the whole connectedness of and all this information for the better of the world, but not feed into the fickleness and the superficiality of men, of people. And I think that something like Twitter only perpetuates it with only 140 words and people who turn to social media to get their news. And I think that social media only makes the superficiality worse. And I think that overall, I think people should read more deeper, in-depth papers if they want to go into and see this news. And if they don't want to go in-depth, do not respond as quickly.
This is coming from 16. Am I on? Sorry about this. It's awkward. That's coming from a 16-year-old talking about social media. I think that's awesome.
Good job, guys. Very impressive.
Thanks to the Shepaug Student Project Foundation, we have some really delicious things to eat afterwards, and certainly these conversations, I think, can continue. I know 2 hours is a long time to sit, but when you're listening to the insights of these 6 individuals, it goes awfully quick. So we're going to have some, we'll hang around. I don't know Ambassador Wallace's schedule, but we'll be around if you want to have some treats afterwards. We have some real great things. I want to take a moment to thank some people. I want to thank first the families of these 5 students who give me the honor to work with them every day. I want to thank I'd like to thank the community for being always so supportive of everything we do here at the school. This attendance-wise, I don't know that we've had anything like this in a long time. It's absolutely wonderful to all the groups who have supported this. It's just remarkable, and we thank you for that. Thanks for letting us have you. And Ambassador Wallace, thank you for giving a piece of yourself. You're an incredibly busy man, and to give up a few hours of yourself on a weekend is greatly appreciated. These events are only as successful as the support of the community, our panelists, and of course, our speakers. So we thank you very much.
Thank you. Great job.